The last thing Maurice Carver remembered, the night he died for 90 seconds at the age of 22, was a woman's voice refusing to let him go. He'd been a rookie. Big, indestructible, 22 years old, and certain of it. And then one ordinary evening, his heart, carrying a flaw nobody had ever found, the kind that drops young athletes where they stand, simply stopped. He went down on a hardwood floor and woke up, days later, in a different world. In between, there had been a white nothing, and a flat electronic scream, and a voice that came down into the dark after him and would not quit. Come on. Come on. Not tonight. Stay with me. He never saw her face. By the time he was strong enough to ask, she was gone, and the hospital was a maze, and the years closed over it. He'd carried that voice for 30 years. A nurse saved my life, he'd say, when the subject came up, and I never even got to say thank you. 30 years later, when Maurice Carver knocked on the door of a small white house with a tidy garden on a quiet street, he had on a plain gray hoodie. No driver, no entourage. 3 championship rings in a safe a long way off. A net worth that didn't fit on a single line, and a slip of paper in his pocket with a name on it that he had spent the better part of a decade and a great deal of money finally tracking down. The door opened. A woman in her 70s, garden dirt on her knees, looked up at the enormous stranger on her porch with the polite wariness of someone who wasn't expecting anybody. And Maurice Carver, who had rehearsed this for 30 years, found that he could not say a single word. She let him in once he managed to say he'd been a patient of hers, long ago, and while she put the kettle on with steady, capable hands. He let his eyes move around the small house, the way they always did when a life had paid a price nobody ever saw. The first thing he noticed was a shadow box on the wall, an old nursing pin, the enameled kind they don't give anymore, mounted with care. The second thing was a faded photograph beside it. A young nurse, unmistakably her, standing next to a fierce-looking older woman in an old-fashioned cap, both of them unsmiling in the way of people who took the work too seriously to mug for a camera. The third thing was what was not on the walls. No commendations, no certificates of excellence. 35 years of saving lives, and not one framed thank you from any institution. A wall that should have been covered, bare. The fourth thing was a pair of white nursing shoes. Ancient, cracked, set neatly by the back door like she still couldn't quite throw them out. The fifth thing was her hands as she set down the tea. 70 years old, knuckles thickening, but steady as a level. The hands that had done the compressions. The hands that hadn't stopped. Maurice noticed every one of them. He did not react. He held the tea and felt the voice from the dark sitting across the table from him. Now here is the part that Maxine Doyle did not understand yet. She thought she'd come to terms with that night, the one that cost her so much decades ago. She had no idea that the enormous man drinking tea in her living room was the patient, that patient, the one from the worst and best night of her career, or that he had spent 30 years looking for her, or that he was about to answer the single question she had carried, unasked and unanswered, for 3 full decades. What Maxine Doyle had no idea about, as she stirred her tea, was one single fact, that the thing she had given up her whole career to save had grown into a man, and the man was sitting on her couch. So stay with us for the whole video, because when Big Mo finally told the nurse who saved his life who he was, her reaction after 30 years of not knowing left this composed man weeping on a stranger's sofa. And it's going to leave you there too. Maurice Carver was 22 the night his heart stopped, a rookie with the world in front of him and a flaw in the muscle of his chest that no physical had ever caught. The kind of hidden thing that kills young athletes mid-stride and makes the morning news. He collapsed. He was rushed in, and, in a crowded emergency room, his heart in a rhythm that wasn't a rhythm, the code ran long and longer, past the point of hope, until the attending physician, by the data, by the protocol, by every reasonable measure, called it. Stepped back. Time of death, more or less, on a 22-year-old. One nurse did not step back. Her name was Maxine Doyle, and she had been trained by a woman named Vera, a fierce old battle axe of a head nurse, long dead now, who had drilled one creed into every nurse who came through her ward until it was scripture. You keep going until the patient says stop, not the doctor, the patient. The doctor calls time. The patient tells the truth. I'm done once. So when the attending called it, and the room began to deflate, Maxine Doyle heard Vera's voice and kept her hands moving on a dead boy's chest and argued, out loud, against a physician, in front of the whole room. One more round? Give me one more round. And she got it. And somewhere in that round, against the odds and the data and the orders she'd defied, the boy's heart caught. He lived. He was rushed up to cardiac surgery, given a diagnosis and a fix that let him keep his whole life. And Maxine Doyle went off shift at dawn and never saw him again. Maurice's reason for finally coming had a face too. A month ago, a 17-year-old named Corey had collapsed at one of Maurice's foundation events with the exact condition that had nearly killed Maurice at 22. And a young ER nurse had caught it and saved the boy's life. Watching that kid walk out of the hospital alive had sent Maurice straight back to a voice in the dark 30 years ago, and a debt he'd never paid. So he'd hired people, and the name they found was Maxine Doyle. Here's what that night cost the woman who refused to stop, the part Maurice was about to learn over a cup of tea. You would think saving a life against the odds would make a nurse a hero. It does not always work that way. Maxine had defied an attending physician in front of a full room. She had been right. The patient lived. But being right is not the same as being obedient. And the hospital's hierarchy did not forgive the insubordination just because it worked. She was written up, formally reprimanded for failure to follow physician direction. The incident sat in her file like a stone. Her trajectory, which had been pointed up, flattened. Within a year, she'd left for a smaller hospital, then a smaller one, a quietly excellent nurse whose paperwork said problem. And she spent the next 30 years near the bottom of a profession she was better at than almost anyone. The attending wasn't a monster, either. Calling a code is sometimes the right and merciful thing, and he'd made a defensible call by every number in front of him. That was the cruelty of it. There was no villain. There was only a system that forced a nurse to choose between the chain of command and a dying boy, and then punished her for choosing the boy. And here was the stone she carried heaviest, the one nobody could see. She had thrown her whole career off course for that patient, and she had never once found out if it had been worth it. He'd been whisked to surgery. She'd transferred out, the records closed. For 30 years, Maxine Doyle had lived with a private, gnawing question that only one person on earth could answer. Did that boy I gave up everything for even survive? Or did I burn down my career holding on to a kid who died upstairs an hour later anyway? She had stopped expecting an answer a long time ago. It came out slowly, over the tea. Maurice asked if she'd worked at a certain hospital, a certain year. Her face changed. He described a night, a young athlete, a long code, a doctor who called it. Maxine Doyle set her cup down very carefully, and her steady hands were not quite steady anymore. I remember that night, she said quietly. I've remembered that night for 30 years. I almost lost my whole career over that night. She looked at him, and something was dawning, something enormous, and she was afraid of it. I never knew his name. I never knew if he... They took him up to surgery, and I never found out if he... Maxine, Maurice said gently. It was me. I'm the boy from that night. You're the voice I heard in the dark. He spread his big hands. I'm the one you wouldn't stop for. There was the convergence the whole afternoon had been sitting inside without her knowing it. The two stories, her sacrifice that night and a life she'd never gotten to see, had been one story the entire time. The career she'd thrown off course, the reprimand in her file, the 30 years near the bottom of her profession, the question that had gnawed at her since she was 40. All of it had an answer. And the answer was a 52-year-old man sitting on her sofa who had gone on to win championships and build a hospital and save, through that hospital, a 17-year-old boy last month with the very thing that had nearly killed him. She hadn't burned down her career for nothing. She'd burned it down for everything. And Maxine Doyle, 70 years old, the woman who never stopped, looked at the living, breathing, grown-up proof that the worst night of her career had been the best thing she ever did. And she did not say, "You're welcome." And she did not say, "Thank you for coming." She asked the question she'd carried for 30 years in 3 broken words to the only person who could finally answer it. You made it? And then she put both of those steady hands over her face and came apart. 30 years of not knowing breaking open all at once. And Maurice Carver, who had come to make an old woman cry tears of gratitude, found himself weeping right alongside her instead, holding the hands that had held onto him when nobody else would. Old Vera's creed had been right, the one she'd drilled into Maxine half a century ago. You keep going until the patient says stop, not the doctor. Maxine had kept going. The patient had never said stop. And 30 years later, the patient had come all this way to tell her so. Here is what Maurice did. He did not just thank her and leave. He took that 30-year-old reprimand, the stone in her file, failure to follow physician direction, and he made it his business to see it expunged and then reversed, her record corrected, and her name finally attached to the honor she should have gotten the morning after. A lifetime award from the very kind of institution that had punished her, presented properly in front of people, with the truth read out loud. He saw to it that her last years held not one worry. And then he did the thing that mattered most. He brought her to Della Carver Memorial, the hospital he'd built, and introduced her to Bea, the young ER nurse who'd saved 17-year-old Corey last month, and to Corey himself, alive and grinning, because Bea had never heard the name Maxine Doyle in her life. And yet she'd done the exact thing Maxine did, held on, advocated, refused to stop. And that meant Vera's creed had traveled, hand to hand to hand, from a dead battle axe to Maxine to a boy who lived to a hospital he built to a young nurse to a kid named Corey. A chain of people refusing to stop that ran straight through the woman who'd thought her life amounted to a stone in a file. You didn't just save me, Maurice told her. You started a chain that's still saving people who will never know your name, including a 17-year-old last month. He smiled through the tears. You kept going until the patient said stop. I never did. Look what you let me become. She had carried one question for 30 years. Did he make it? He drove across the state to put the answer in her hands. And so should you. If there's someone out there who saved you, and never found out how the story ended. So look at what one overdue knock on one small door revealed. A young nurse and a teenage boy, alive and saving lives downstream, who'd never know they were links in a chain a fierce old woman started 50 years ago. A reprimand turned, at last, into the honor it always should have been, a dead mentor's creed, proven to have outlived her by half a century. And a nurse who spent 30 years near the bottom of her profession, carrying a stone and an unanswered question, who found out she'd never been at the bottom of anything. She'd been holding up a life she was never allowed to see. She asked it in 3 words, with 30 years behind them. You made it? He did. Because she wouldn't stop. So find them, if they're still out there, the ones who held on when everyone else let go, and tell them how it turned out. And so should you. If someone once saved your life, a nurse, a doctor, a stranger, and never found out whether you made it, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and maybe, just maybe, they'll see it. If this story moved you, hit that like button, because it helps stories about the people who refuse to stop reach the ones who need them. And if you believe nobody who saved a life should die wondering whether it mattered, subscribe and join this community. There are more of us than you'd think, and we don't stop. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. We will see you there.